one that seems most justifiable to pick. So you seem to have made a decision to be atheist. Does it take faith to stay an atheist?
Well, yeah, of course everybody makes a decision. I mean, I should hope, those of you who are religious believers made that decision. I was not born, I guess, having a theist or an atheistic belief. I like to think that I came to my position based on my own open-ended, research and consideration, and that I'm still open-ended to changing my points of view. And I do change my points of view all the time on lots of rather important things. Not on my skepticism of God, although my views on God are not just that I don't believe in God. I've refined my understanding of God, so I continue to be open to inquiry. But on balance of evidence, I, at the moment, believe that it's more likely God doesn't exist than God does exist. And I should say I'm not what they call a strong atheist, that I know God doesn't exist, or I have the positive assertion that God doesn't exist. I'm a skeptic of the existence of God. I just don't think that there's compelling enough evidence for me to, assert that claim.
Yeah, and again, skepticism is the position that says the evidence is 50-50 on each side. Therefore, I can't reasonably choose between the two, and so I remain agnostic. That kind of skepticism is very honorable. And of course, all Christians ought to be skeptical in that respect if the evidence is 50-50. So the claim is, of course, is the evidence for atheism and theism 50-50, such that skepticism is now rationally allowable. So again, I think Justin would say, well, he's a skeptic, and maybe you'd say, actually, I lean toward atheism being more probable because the evidence is in favor of atheism as opposed to theism. And of course, as a theist, I think the evidence is much more probable for theism. That's why I'm not a skeptic of that, though of course, it's not self-evident or otherwise. And faith, of course, I would define as holding on to that which you know to be right or likely right. And so for Justin to have faith in atheism being likely true is a perfectly rational attitude to have, given that this would be, in fact, reasonable. I disagree that the evidence is in favor of atheism, and so I think his faith is in vain, or rather misplaced, but that he has faith in it is, of course, a good thing to do, given what he thinks is right.
If I may come back on that. So I would not want to accept that my atheism is a faith at all. I would rather suggest that when somebody puts forward an extraordinary claim of any kind, and I think the existence of God is a fairly extraordinary one, that you really have to look at where the burden of evidence lies, and I think it's usually put on, with good sense, the person making the extraordinary claim. So it's not a faith to be atheist about the existence of other extraordinary things, other kinds of gods, for example. We're all atheists about, well, lots of different kinds of gods. That makes sense, right? So similarly, with the existence of the Christian God or the monotheistic God, again, unless there's good evidence, I think you can quite honestly conclude that you are an atheist until the evidence is presented. But I prefer to say I'm a skeptic, because if the evidence were presented, I would assert that my mind had been changed, as I would assert my mind had been changed about any other extraordinary claim if evidence were suddenly available.
I know Dana had a question, and just for the sake of time, there's only going to be her, and then I wanted to ask a question as well. So,
I want to get to the pub. Come on.
Yeah, I know that's fine.
I'm getting thirsty, and I can't change the Redeemer.
So Dana, go ahead, Danica.
And how do you explain morals without terms? We talk a lot about pain and pleasure, but there are also morals that don't go for pain and pleasure. And for Christians, there are a lot that, especially Christ's sacrifice, that completely go against that. So how would you explain that?
Yeah, pain and pleasure is I think one good foundation. I think a lot of things can be boiled down to we as a human species and pleasure, by the way, is not hedonistic pleasure. Even Epicurus didn't mean pleasure in that way. Utilitarianism, which again, both of us agree is limited or the wrong way to look at things, is not just about hedonistic pleasure. There are different interpretations, of course, of utilitarianism, but it's taken to mean happiness, it's taken to mean the good, maximizing the good, however you want to define that. So pain and pleasure sort of stand in for that humans like certain things and dislike other things, and that it's a truth of the human condition that that's the case. And there are other truths about the human condition which rational inquiry can ascertain. And again, our species is unique in having rational faculties, and that's why we're able to figure out what those truths are. And that's kind of where I stand on this whole issue, is that there are certain attributes of the human condition. If those attributes were different, our moral code would be different. So in that sense, I am a bit of a relativist. But in any universe in which it had a social species like humans, and that had rationality, for which things like the pleasure and pain that I was referring to are true, then there is only one acceptable standard, and that's how we can get our sense of right and wrong.
All right, go ahead.
Yeah?
Yeah, you got
Okay.
it.
Then what if there are specific actions which which actually brought about pain in one individual but pleasure in another? And if those two contrasted, then which one would you say is right or wrong?
Well, I'm not a consequentialist, right? I presented a few different ways of looking at morality. I think that all of those schools of thought are onto something, and I think that you can bring them all to bear on each moral question. So, purely speaking on a consequentialist framework, if there were only two people in the universe, and one person derived pleasure from committing some horrible act against the other person, and that person's pleasure outweighed that person's pain, consequentialists would say that that's acceptable. But I'm not a consequentialist, and it isn't the only way to look at things. And most ethical theorists these days would ascribe to a combination of different approaches, different frameworks, because they're inquirers, as I put it, right? So they would want to look at different ways of understanding the same issue. And certainly, if you look at it in say, a Rawlsian theory of justice is fairness, if you were creating a universe from scratch that only had two people, and you didn't know if you were going to be the guy committing the pain or the pleasure, you'd probably not want to have a universe where people can get away with that. So, yeah, you can look at these in different ways, and our moral understanding evolves in that sense.
All right, here's my question. You mentioned intuition. I want to ask you about intuition. The Bible, it hints at two ideas. That every one of us is fallen, is a sinner, has brought forth evil or sin into the world. And it also hints at this idea that there is an objective moral law: thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not commit adultery. These are things that we can know intuitively. But here's the point, is that when that law was made, it was made for the exact purpose of showing us that we were unable to keep that law. Every single one of us here, and as Christians we would admit, I have broken that law. I have stolen. I have committed adultery, at least within my own heart. We are all sinners. So here's my question, and it's a bit deep, it's a bit personal. I want to put you on the spot here. Do you feel...
It's personal to me?
Yeah.
Oh boy, okay.
Do you feel that you, in a sense, need forgiveness for some of the evil that you brought into the world?
Huh. That's not on my list of questions to anticipate. But I will add it for the next debate. Do I feel that I've committed bad deeds? Well, certainly. Certainly. I guess I'm a sinner in that sense. I'm not sure, though, that I would feel that I needed a God to apologize to for those deeds. I think that those sins were all committed against other people. Or they were sort of abstract. They were sins, maybe that didn't hurt another person, but they in a subtle way, broke the coherence or the fabric of our social structure. Maybe I lied to somebody, for example, and the person never knew, and there was really no direct harm done. But I know that if lies were done routinely, then we wouldn't be able to trust anything in our society, right? So I can understand, again, rationality, intelligence, to your point, that breaks society down just a little bit. So I feel guilty because of the way it affects other people, and because I wouldn't want lying to become a rule that other people thought that they could get away with it. So yeah, I'm a sinner.
Barkman?
Are you a sinner, Brian?
No, man.
I broke the moral law, I've sinned, but if God is the source of the moral law, then I've also wronged God on top of the individuals I've wronged. And I need to confess that.
All right, I think that's it for now. I hope you guys had fun. If we give a round of applause for both